So, thank you for joining me, Dictator, and helping me out with this explanation. Hello to you.
Hello.
Even though we've been talking for the last, 2 hours or so. So, why don't you go a little bit through... let's assume that a zone has only non-combats and combats and nothing else is going on. Why don't you help us kind of understand how the game picks what we're going to get?
Well, first of all, it starts at the top, as always. But as we just stated, nothing special is going on in the zone. We don't have a clover, we're not drunk. There's no semi-rares, no wandering monsters available, no goblins. So we make it all the way to the blue box, well, just below the middle of non-combat and combat faction. Here the game will roll a die and compare that to the non-combat chance of the zone as adjusted by any equipment and buffs and stuff you're wearing, and see if you get a non-combat or a combat. And then it goes to that side of the selection process. If you get a non-combat, it makes a list of all the non-combats in the zone. And if that list happens to be empty, because there's no non-combats in the zone, or the non-combats that you could get are not available right now, it will redirect you to the combat side. Let's assume that happens for now. Or that you roll the combat in the first place. So we're at a combat. It will try to roll for a combat. So it rolls another die to select which monster of all the monsters in that zone you're going to fight.
Yeah.
This is simple enough, except an extra step comes in here. Because the game is kind enough to you to suppress bad streaks a little. So you don't get the same wrong monster lots of times in a row. So it then tries to figure out if this is actually the monster that you're getting. And that is the part that this entire episode is all about. How does this queue rejection all work?
Okay. And to explain that, we have to talk about something called the queue. Now, we were just talking about this. The queue is a little bit of a misnomer because we're actually discussing past encounters, not future encounters. So when we're talking about a queue, we're not talking about a queue for what encounter you're about to get, which is, I imagine, what a lot of people would assume it means, including myself once upon a time. So it's probably better to think of it as being a combat history. Now, every zone in the game has its own discrete combat history. So, for example, if I spend a zone in the Guano Junction, whatever happens in the Guano Junction stays in the Guano Junction. Similarly, if I adventure I venture one turn in the Guano Junction and then one turn in the Noob Cave. Those two places have absolutely separate zones and they are not in any way linked. That's the first thing to remember. Now, the encounter history, so that's the queue. From here forth, we're going to refer to it as history. Is that correct, Dictator?
Yeah.
So
let's try to anyway.
Yeah. So we're going to call the queue the history / the combat history of a zone. Now, the combat history of a zone is 5 slots. Now, let me get my fancy infographic up. Here it is. Hopefully everyone can see that. So, essentially, we have a zone. Let's say this zone is called Zone A. And this zone has 2 monsters in it, 2 encounters, 2 possible monsters. When we've not spent any turns in that zone, we have what I've displayed here as 5 empty squares. Now, those 5 empty squares symbolize the queue, or as we're going to be calling it, the combat history. So if we've never spent a turn in that zone, then there is no combat history, because something has to have happened for a history to exist. I mean, that's the definition of a history. The queue of a zone is deleted in one of two ways. A is rollover, and B is a new ascension. That's correct, right, Dictator?
Does it clear on rollover? I don't think so. I think only ascending works.
I'm on the wiki, and the wiki says, let's see, rollover. The adventure queue does not reset on rollover. Excuse me. So the adventure queue does not reset on rollover, but it does reset on ascension. Although there was something really weird with the time spinner and some kind of exploit.
Yeah.
I don't even know how that works.
Time spinner was weird. Originally, it also didn't empty on Ascension, but that got really weird because it meant that it was optimal to prep all your zones before actually jumping the gash.
Yeah. Terrible. Anywho, so the only way now to delete the queue is by ascending. Otherwise, your queue will be whatever state it was the last time you adventured in that zone. Okay, so that's point one. Let me go back to my notes. Right, so nothing's in the history. The pool of encounters, so each zone has a number of encounters, that is, available monsters that you can fight. They each have an equal chance to occur. So if you've got 2 monsters in a zone and no queue, then you'd have a 50% chance of getting monster A and a 50% chance of getting monster B. I think in this case I've called it monster 1 and monster 2, and then the zone is called A. So if, for example, a zone already has 5 things in it, so I've got on this infographic, we're assuming a full queue, so we've got monster 1, monster 2, monster 2, number 1, number 2 again. The red box here is pushed out for the next encounter. So that means the encounter queue is pushed from left to right. So the state of our queue is 1, 2, 2, 1, 2. And then we get a new combat, and that monster is 1. That means that the number 2 at the very end of the queue here is pushed out, and number 1 is added in. So the queue is now 1, 1, 2, 2, 1. Now, you may be asking, what does this matter? What does it matter what's in the queue or whatever? So I'll let Dictator kind of explain about rejection in the queue.
Yeah. When a monster's in the queue, to give you a little more spread out encounters, if a monster has been encountered recently and it gets rolled again, there's a 75% chance that it gets rejected, because it is already in the last 5 encounters of history. So they're like, yeah, no, let's try this again. So for the zone there's a 70 that gets rolled again. There's a 75% chance that it gets rejected, and we try again to come up with a new monster. And do it again. Maybe it's the same monster, and now it gets selected. Those are all possible. One thing to note is that even if all you encountered was and you roll up monster 1 again, it's still only a 75% chance to get rejected. It does not try to reject it for all the copies in the history. No, just if it's in the history, it can get rejected. This rejection can only happen up to 100 times, though that's highly unlikely to happen, so it's not something you have to worry about much.
Yeah. Did we calculate it's 1 in 10 trillion?
10 trillion or something.
Yeah, 1 in 10 trillion. So if that happens to anyone, congratulations.
Also, you won't know it happened, probably.
Yeah, you just wouldn't. Yeah, exactly. Unless you've got like a queue full of, like you've got like a 20 monster zone, and the only thing in the queue are 1 monster, and you get that 1 monster or something. I mean,
then there's still a very high chance that it just didn't get rejected, rather than made it all the way through this 100.
Yeah. Anyway, we digress. So,
yeah,
the chance to calculate whether you are going to receive a monster that's already in the queue is 1 over 4e minus 3u. What does that mean? it means that E is the total number of encounters in the zone that we're going to hereforth call the pool or the zone pool. And then U is the unique encounters already in the queue. So in my little graphic here, I'm saying that when you first come to a 2-monster zone that has a native pool of 2, therefore you have an equal odd of getting either monster 1 or monster 2. Now, if you assume that you got monster 1 as the first encounter, then that means that monster number 1 is in the queue and has that 75% rejection. Now, the chance changes due to 1 having that 75% rejection each time it's rolled, which is that the equation I just showed you before, which is 4e minus 3u, which turns out to be that you have about a 20% chance of getting 1 again and about 80% chance of getting 2 again. Now, obviously, that's compounded, so the chance of getting 1 5 times in a row in a 2-monster zone is 0.2 to the power of 5. So if that happens to you, you should be very upset. And it does happen. As
occasionally, yeah.
As statistics happen, it does happen. Yeah. So sometimes people use the term soft banish, and by soft banish we're talking about a queue banish, which means the natural 75% rejection that something has when it is in the queue. So sometimes when you have a banish, and those banishes are obviously a limited resource, you don't always want to banish something because you kind of want to assume based on mathematical statistics that something won't happen because it's more likely that something else will happen. But obviously in an Ascension, what happens if you don't banish something is that for some reason the RNG feels like, no, it's going to happen anyway, and then you get punished for it because that's how it works, right? But
of course,
in theory, you have a good example is the bedroom, right? So you have a 5-monster zone, technically a 6-monster zone, but we're going to ignore that. We've got a 5-monster zone with 6 turns of delay. We want to get 2 ornate nightstands and a single elegant nightstand on the very last turn, right? So what you probably want to do is use, I'd say, a couple of banishes there, but if you use up to 4 banishes there, it feels a bit of a waste because it means that you've wasted a lot of resources when you need to spend A, turns for delay, and B, there's only so many combats that you actually need in that zone. So what you can do is kind of rely on the mathematical statistics that something already being in the queue is likely not to come back again. As shown here, like a 50% chance goes down to a 20% chance. When the queue is bigger, that number gets bigger, I believe. Does that sound right? It's on the adventure.
When the pool is bigger, it will go down more. Yes.
So, for example, here it says if you're in a zone with 3 monsters and there's 1 monster in the queue, you've only got a 11% chance to get that monster again. If you have 2 monsters in the queue, there's a 16.67% chance that you'll get the monster again. So that means that you've got almost an 84% chance to get the monster that you do want, rather than the 2 that you don't want. Anyway, one thing to remind yourself of is that you can count on the rejection chance being a soft banish, which means that you can potentially save an actual resource using banish, for example, Asden, Spring Bumper, or I don't know, something like Baleful Howl in Dark Gift, etc. But this is a top. The banish topic is something we'll cover in the actual podcast. So moving on, where are we up to now? So both.
One thing to note.
Yep.
Yeah, one thing to note is that such a history exists for both combat and non-combat, but they're 2 separate lists, and also for each zone separate.
Absolutely.
But with the non-combat, there's a special thing going on. A non-combat is not added to the history list unless you take a choice that actually costs a turn. So if you pick all the usually last options in the non-combat that just make you run away without doing anything, it won't get added to the history, and you're just as likely to see it again as if you hadn't encountered it at all.
Absolutely.
This means that very occasionally it can actually be worth to spend a turn to get the non-combat added to the queue, so you will be less likely to see it again, even if you didn't want the non-combat in the first place. Of course, this then costs you a turn for a chance to save a fraction of a turn looking for that other non-combat that you actually do want. But in something like the castle ground floor, where you have to spend 10 turns to burn the delay anyway, you might as well non-combat but so that you're more likely to find one of the other non-combats and maybe get yourself a better chance of picking up that boning knife while going through your first run of. But this is only relevant in zones where you need to burn delay and you're looking for a specific non-combat, which not all that many of them.
Literally the ground floor and
debatably the ballroom.
Yeah.
If you want to set a song, mostly.
Yeah.
For the gallery, which could have been an option,
it's already banished
there's
anyway.
A special mechanic where if you run away from the garden, it banishes the garden adventure for the next 10 turns. So you are better off doing that.
Mm-hmm.
And finding the Louvre that way.
Okay. So, where are we up to? If you... right.
Only monsters that you actually encounter as part of the normal encounter process get added to the history. If you fight a wandering monster, or you wish for it, or you macrometeorite into it, it does not get added to the history. This can be both good and bad, depending on what you want with the monster. But it means it's something to keep in mind. Also, because the time spinner lets you spin up monsters that are in the history list for all the zones you have access to. Which can mean that you might not want to macrometeorite, for example, because if you then fight the monster you're looking for, you can't time spin it. That's less relevant now that the time spinner is no longer in standard. But it's useful to know for non-standard, and it's handy to know how the time spinner works in general, because you can also use this to check your queues if you want to know something or test something.
So, what I like to call the time spinner a relic of your queue. So, let's say you go to the airship and you can't remember what the queue was like when you last went to the airship. You can actually go to your time spinner and have a look what's available in your time spinner from the airship. For example, let's say you have the available monsters you can time spin are the protagonist, the burly sidekick, and the spunky princess, which only adds up to 3. But that's because you can obviously have duplicate copies of a monster in the same queue. So you could have, for example, 3. If you encounter 3 protagonists, the protagonist would be in the 5 slots 3 times. The burly sidekick would be once, and the spunky princess would be once in the queue as well. All of whom would have 75% rejection. So in theory, it's
and all of them are time spinnable.
Yes, in theory,
and the others are not.
Yeah, in theory, it's unlikely that you would get something multiple times in the queue, but obviously it does happen. It's less likely the higher the number of encounters there are in a queue. So in the 8-bit zone where you've got a very large pool, if you got 5 bullet bills in a row, that would be very, very unlikely, but also not impossible. So yeah, I'll probably do a little bit of fun maths later on to say how unlikely it would be to get 5 bullet bills in a row. Yeah. So banished monsters are put into the history. So that means if I encounter we're in the airship, I encounter a protagonist and I banish him, he's removed from the pool, so the zone pool of monsters available that I can roll for, but he's also put into the queue. So if, for example, if I use, let's say, the throw latte, and then that would banish the protagonist, and then I refill my latte, and then I banish something else. The banish will stop on the protagonist, but he will still have the 75% rejection because he's in the queue. And as long as he's in the queue, he has that rejection. That's probably a simple way to kind of look at it.
Yeah, though in the airship, that's not great because you're spending more than 5 encounters, so he'll fall out of the queue eventually.
Yeah, and you may as well have not bothered to banish if you were going to do that. Dictator, can you expand a little bit on Macrometeor and how that works?
Macrometeor, when you use it, rolls up a new monster of that zone, but automatically a different one than the one you're currently fighting. But it bypasses the normal queue selection mechanics, so it does not check the history, but it also does not edit to the history. This makes Macrometeorite much better to use before you have something sniffed, for example, because then it might find you the monster that you're looking to sniff. After you've something sniffed, it does not benefit from the fact that you have something sniffed anymore. And because it bypasses the addition to the history as well, if you find a monster that you don't want, you Macrometeorite it. Say we're in the Haunted Wine Cellar. You run into a Wino, you're like, fuck, you Macrometeorite it, and then you get a sommelier, because of course you do. Now you can definitely banish the sommelier, or you can Macrometeorite again. In this case, banishing is a really good choice, because the sommelier is not in the history list, while the Wino still is. So banishing him gets you a zone with 2 monsters, and the one you don't want is already in a history list. So you're really likely to find your wine rack now. If you Macrometeorite the sommelier, you have a 50-50 chance to just get the Wino back that you got rid of in the first place. And if you banish the Wino right at the start, you end up with a 2-monster zone where both monsters are equally likely, rather than a 2-monster zone where the one you don't want is already in the queue.
So,
but this assumes first of all, this assumes that Macrometeorites and banishes are roughly interchangeable, and that you, don't have enough banishes to just banish everything, which is actually a possibility with enough item of demands and the Seal Club or Battle Rep skill, for example. In that case, you're better off just banishing everything you don't want to see, because then you definitely won't see them again, rather than probably don't see them again.
Yeah. So in the case of getting the Wino, using Macrometeorite, and getting the skeleton, if you kill the skeleton, it doesn't add to the queue. If you banish it, it does add to the queue. And obviously it's also banished. But killing it would mean that it's not added to the queue, so then you've only got a 50% chance of getting either the skeleton or the wine rack, correct?
Banishing doesn't add the skeleton to the queue, but it doesn't really matter if it's in the history or not, if you banish it anyway.
Yeah. So we use the term sniff. What do we actually mean by sniff? So,
the name sniff comes from the skill Transcendent Olfaction, which in its flavor lets you literally like sniff out the monster and then start to track it like some sort of wolfhound.
Yeah, bloodhound, yeah.
But it was the first edition of such a mechanic, but it's definitely not last. So it has been used more generally as well. All of these skills add extra copies of a monster to the zones it's already in, making you more likely to roll them when you roll for an encounter. This should not be confused with other methods of adding copies, such as Spooky Putty or the camera, or with methods that make a copy and drop it directly into the zone, such as Digitize or Rammering. So we'll call these copies pool copies. And, well, there's a pretty large list that I'll let Aenimus I'll talk you through.
Okay, so the reason why we say pool copies is because we're assuming that a zone has a number of encounters, and that encounter is a pool because you've got a chance of getting this, or that. So that's why we're calling them pool copies. Now, Transcendent Olfaction gives you +3 copies. Get a good whiff of this guy from the nosy nose gives you +1 copy. Daily Affirmation, become superficially interested, which is a very big mouthful, gives you, was it 3 copies?
Probably, yes.
Probably 3 copies. Galapagosian, there we go. Galapagosian mating call from the Illustrated Mating Rituals of the Galapagos, which is also from the Madame Zatara's Relationship Fortune Teller. Try and say that 5 times fast.
These names are getting way too long.
Is +1, I believe. Yeah, +1, right?
Yeah. Just
offer latte to opponent, which is from the Latte Lovers members mug, is +2. I believe you stated that one.
Yeah. It's a little vague, but it's probably 2, based on it sort of consistently falling between 1 and 3.
Yeah. And then the various avatar sniffs, such as, for example, Dark Gifts, Perceive Soul. This is probably 2 to 3. Spading is ongoing. It looks very likely to be 3, but it could also be under the threshold of 2, and then it could be just really bad luck because not enough trials for it to be like 1 or even like 4 or something. But we're going to say 2 to 3 for now until we have a lot more data points. So something like that. They all have their own number of copies. Really old copiers like what was something shout? Was it in Boris? Was it?
Boris had a banishing shout. I don't think he had a.
He didn't have a sniff. Did any other sniffs in any of that?
Jarlsberg has a Staff of the Cream whose jiggle ability makes you more likely to encounter the monster you use it on.
Does anyone have any clue how that works?
According to the wiki, it's 2 copies and it removes rejection.
Oh. I'm going to talk a little bit about that in a moment, but for now, I guess I'll finish this. So, again, no matter how you encountered a monster, that is a wish or a fax or something like that, if you use something that creates a pool copy, so these sniff skills, it adds it to every single zone that monster is native to. So if I wish for a green ops soldier and then I olfact it, I use become superficially interested, get a good whiff of this guy, offer my latte to him, have turtle sex with him, etc., it will add however many copies that is to the battlefield. Okay, good. So let's assume we are wishing for an AMC gremlin. If anyone does this, I'll be very, very upset.
We'll take away their speedrunning license.
Yeah, you'll be banned from the Discord. And we use Transcendent Olfaction on the AMC gremlin. That means that every zone, so in this case it's the 4 gremlin zones, because each of those zones has a chance to encounter the AMC gremlin, would have 4 copies of the AMC gremlin and also be removed of rejection, but we'll go into that in a second. So just remember that those 4 copies are the native copy plus 3 olfacted copies. Okay, so why is Transcendent Olfaction so good compared to other types of pool copy creators? And I'm going to let Dictator talk about this.
Aside from what all the others also do, adding a number of copies, Transcendent Olfaction has a second ability, as does that jiggle I was just talking about. It removes the rejection rate of that monster. So if you want to meet that monster again, normally you would have to first, even if there's 4 copies of it in the zone, it's still all the same monster. So when it rolls up that monster, it goes to check against the encounter history of the zone, and it's like, yeah, we just had that thing, so let's toss it out and try again. With 4 copies in the zone, there's a good chance that it will roll the same monster again and not reject it the next time, maybe. But Transcendent Olfaction skips this whole step. The monster that you olfacted does not get rejected at all.
No matter what.
Well, probably. Not this rejection, anyway.
Yeah.
If it's a monster that you can only fight while on the quest or something, then it will still not show up even after when the quest is done. But the history rejection gets disabled for that specific monster. And this is actually a pretty big deal compared to adding of copies. In my fading, a little joking around, I spent 1,500 turns in the hole in the sky. Or 1,500 encounters because I was running away. I banished the astronomer because he's annoying. And then I was left with 9 monsters. I threw literally all the things on this list that I had access to on the junk. And then counted how many junks I encountered. And roughly 60% of the encounters was a junk. After that, I wanted to see how much of a difference it made. I used a soft green echo eye drop antidote. Speaking of long names. And removed on the trail. So that I was only left with, well, all the other things. This made the junk go from 11 effective copies in the zone to only 8 copies in the zone. And this is compared to 8 other monsters in the zone. But because they kept clashing into each other and, well, being rejected, now only 30% of the encounters was junks.
So 50% efficiency lost.
Yes, which just goes to show how effective it is to stop that collision when you are trying to find the same monster lots of times quickly.
So TLDR is that removing rejection and maybe not even adding copies is much, much better than just adding copies. There's probably a threshold where there's an insane number of copies that makes it better than removing rejection, but that would have to be huge.
It's higher than the total number of copies we can currently add.
Exactly. Okay, so what does banishing do? So when you banish a monster, it only removes the native monster. What does that mean? Well, this only matters if you've used what we've listed before, a sniff on a monster. So to give you an example, let's say we are in the billiard room and we encounter a wraith, and then we sniff the wraith. So that means that the billiard room now becomes a 5 monster zone. That's 4 wraiths and 1 billiard golem. Also,
Poltergeist.
Poltergeist, sorry, yeah. And then also the ultra rare, but we're not going to talk. We'll pretend the ultra rare guy doesn't exist, just for this example. He's probably not even.
I've never seen him, so that's probably true.
He's probably not even a combat. He's probably some special thing.
Probably.
Who knows? Who knows? So we've got 4 wraith copies and 1 poltergeist. Now, if you immediately banish the wraith after you've just sniffed it, it will remove the native copy. Oh. I just got a subscription, so that kind of made me jump a little bit. Thank you. Winding thought.
Cool.
So back on track. If we banish that wraith, then the native copy is lost, and then the remaining 3 copies created by all faction remain. So you can only ever banish the native copy. It doesn't matter how many different copies you have. It doesn't matter how many banishes you use. It will, after the first initial banish, nothing will happen, essentially. I think that's...
It doesn't even matter how many copies there were in the zone already. Some zones have multiple copies of one monster to make it a little more likely to see it. Like the Astronomer I mentioned in the and also the Eyesore, the irritating series of random encounters in the airship. Both of those occur twice natively. If you banish one, the others also automatically gone, which makes them really good use of a banish, actually.
Yeah. So banishes also because banishes banish the monster from every zone in which it's native. That means if you banish a gremlin, and as we all know, some of the gremlins appear in multiple zones. The wrong gremlins appear in 2 zones each, and the AMC gremlin appears in all 4 zones. That means if you banish those, it will banish them from every single zone because they are native to that zone, and the banish removes the native copy from all native zones. I think that's a good way to look at it. Similarly, you want to explain this? Similarly, the monsters you encounter as a result of macrometeorite rerolls have additional value.
Yeah, this is back to the original talk about macrometeorite. This makes these banishes on gremlins a very good banish because you can get rid of a monster before you've even encountered it once in a zone, which means it's not even in a queue yet. Where normally you would run into the monster first, it gets added to the history, and there's the rejection rate already working, and then you banish it anyway, just because you want to make really sure. This is a decent use of a banish, and what most banishes are used for. But banishing gremlins has more value than that, because you get rid of them before you even encounter them once. So you bypass, you don't make up the difference between that rejection chance and not at all. You just make up the difference between totally not encountering them.
Yeah.
And this makes them extra valuable, which brings us back to that macrometeorite point. The banishing the monster you macrometeorite into is similarly extra valuable, because he was also not added to that zone's history.
So, Dictator, let's make a TLDR, or TLDL, I guess, of what we've been through. We'll start with, basically, you look at the zone encounter hierarchy to work out the chance of getting either a non-combat or a combat, both of which have a queue. The queue, or the history of a zone, is 5 slots. If the queue is full, the rightmost slot is pushed out and the new slot is added in.
The oldest monster gets forgotten about.
Oldest monster, oldest non-combat. Multiple... something can be in the queue more than once. The only thing...
But
Go ahead.
something can be queued more than once, and it takes up more spots that way, but it won't make it more likely to get rejected.
Yeah, it's only ever 75% chance of being rejected. And when it's rejected, it's re-rolled, which means you could still get it again. It's not like it's rejected and like soft banished or something. It's just re-rolled. And that re-roll, for the purposes of this discussion, is infinite. It's not, but it's basically infinite.
For practical purposes, it is.
Yeah. So that's the queue. Banishes. Banish the native monster from all native zones. Wishing, faxing, etc. Do not add stuff to the queue.
Encountering a monster as result of a choice in a non-combat does not add it to the queue, which is relevant in especially the airship.
Mm-hmm. Also, I believe those non-combat choices do not care about banishes either. So if you've got, for example, the protagonist banished, you could still get him in the non-combat combat choice, right?
Yeah, they just pick from a list hard-coded in that non-combat.
Yeah.
And that one does not go through the normal queue selection process. So if you have the healer olfacted, that also does not help for the non-combat.
TLDL of all factions / copies is that having no rejection is insane and much better than having lots of copies of something because of that innate 75% rejection chance. Copies stay even if you banish until you somehow remove, or they run. Usually it's a case of running out of that particular copy. For example, I think most copies...
Or using it again.
Or using it again. That's a good way to look at it. Is there anything else that we need to TLDL? Macrometeorite. The thing that you encounter doesn't enters the queue. The thing that you macrometeorite into does not enter the queue. Which is good.
Knowing which monsters enter the queue and which don't can be helpful because it lets you pick the more valuable targets to banish.
Exactly. And very, very lastly, I want to show my Mafia. So if you open up your Mafia and you have a look at Adventure, the Adventure tab, and then you go to the Overview tab, and then on the right-hand side is another tab here, which says Session Results, Location Details, Conditions Left, etc. Right underneath the Custom Combats tab, you can click Location Details, and then that will give you a list of all the encounters of the zone, and it will also give you the chance of encountering that monster. So, as you can see, for the Arid Extra Dry Desert, there's 5 monsters in the zone: the Cactuari, the Giant Centipede, Plaque of Locust, Rock Scorpion, Swarm of Fire Ants. And Mafia is telling me that I've got a 28% chance for 3 of those monsters and a 7% chance for 2. That means that my current queue is composed of Giant Centipedes and Plaque of Locusts. So I've still got some chance of getting those, even though they have the 75% rejection chance. But then I've got an equal chance among the other things that have no rejection to get those, and it's a slightly higher chance also because they don't have rejection. I know that's a bit of a mouthful, but all I'm trying to get at is that you can look at the Mafia Adventure.
Mafia can tell you these things.
Mafia tells you these things, yeah. And you can use the equation here, which is 1 over 4e minus 3u, where e is the number of encounters in the zone and u is the unique encounters already in the queue, to work out the likelihood that you will get a monster. Right, I think that's about it. So thank you very much for joining me, Dictator.
Thank you.
And we'll see you all next week for the actual podcast. Bye-bye.
I'll be listening.
Bye-bye.